Hi, I want to welcome you to Answers for Today. I'm so once again glad to be with you here in Southern California in Studio G. We got Chris over in Texas in his studio over there for another great program, spending time talking about our great God and Savior, Jesus Christ. We love talking about the Lord, the impact of the scriptures around the world. And, you know, a lot of times when we look at the scriptures and eschatology and the things that are coming, the only thing that we kind of see and focus on is here in the United States. Well, that's where we live, and we understand that that's very important to us. But as far as when you look at the Bible, we have to look at the global perspective. You know, somebody asked me, so, "Are you a globalist?" I go, "Well, sort of, because God so loved the world, and He gave His only begotten Son, and the fact is that God deals with the whole world as far as His concern about the end of the world and the rapture of the church and the things that are to be coming into play." In the last week's program, we shifted gears a little bit as we start off in the first half of the program and talk a little bit about politics and Christian ethics, and should Christians be in politics, and what should we be doing, but this week programs, I'd like to have Chris give us an update of what's happening in Israel. About 3-4 weeks ago, we did a program on the peace plan, what was happening, not only with how it's moving forward with the one that our president, with Jared Kushner and the rest of them, moved forward with, as we saw how their wonderful plan, where we saw, really was, instead of peace for land and switching off land, now peace for prosperity, which make, not only sense for the regular worker of that day over there in Israel and the surrounding countries, but it seems to be making sense to a lot of other countries because they're starting to sign up for this peace plan. And so I thought, since we had Chris on the line, that Chris would give us an update what's happening in Israel with this peace plan and other things happening there. Why don't you give us a little update, Chris? And by the way, welcome to the program.
Good to be with you again, Terry. Yeah, it's been interesting since the last time that we discussed it. Another country has come on board, Bahrain, and it's just interesting to see that all this work has been being done when the world's been preoccupied with COVID. They've been working on this, but Israel's now back into another round of shutdown, and it's really kind of stifled a number of things, and so it's kind of cooled down a bit. But you know that behind the scenes, this is still going on, still taking place. We're in a campaign here in this country too, so that does slow it down a little bit. But the more that you think about it, and I know that we had discussed it the last time, and if people get a chance to look at the maps, there are two real distinct groups within Christianity that pay attention to this. Some see it as the United States really putting us in a great state of peril of giving away land for peace because it's dividing up the land. And I look at this, and basically, since I've been there, like I said on the last time that we discussed it, it's really kind of formalizing what already exists, and it's what Israel has already agreed to. This only formalizes it. And so it's not that they have to give up new land. They're not taking back new land. They're just kind of ratifying where things kind of are anyway. So however people want to look at that, they can draw their own conclusions from it. But what I find interesting is that the countries that are signing on to it and the ones that are sitting on the sidelines, as opposed to the ones who will never get on board. And that's the thing that's going to be interesting, that even if they could get another, half dozen countries to sign on to this, at some point they're going to reach the bottom of that well. And it's the countries that are not willing to come on board that will never come on board until I believe the man of sin is able to bring this over the finish line. But I really think he's going to use this kind of a model because it's so different than anything that's been tried before. So the land becomes a secondary issue, and it's really brought about because the people are able to live in prosperity, which would also bring a peaceful resolution as they may see it. And then it becomes a real big deal when the Antichrist really reveals himself.
Chris, case there are those who missed our first broadcast concerning this plan. Why don't you update them with the thought is behind the prosperity? How would that play in Israel? How would play in the other countries that are signing in? What would be attractive to them to both sides? Why would they even want to sign up for this?
Sure. Well, there are a couple of moving parts to it. The thing that's not really as obvious, the Trump administration took this tact in the whole thing. They said, look, the reason that there's unrest is because there's some bad actors in the area, mainly Iran, and then the proxies of the terrorists, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the elements of the terrorist wings within the Palestinian Authority, or what's the old PLO. And so Trump said the best thing that we could do, or that the administration's view, the best way to get that fixed is to so marginalize the radicals that they have no choice but to either come to the table or their people are going to run them over. They figure that they can starve out Iran by having everybody else normalize with Israel, and having commercial ties with them is of financial benefit. And then the people that live in the West Bank and Gaza are going to end up pressuring their government to get on board because everybody else is doing well around them while they are dying, basically. So that's the open secret in this whole thing, is that it's intended to marginalize the radicals, the Shiites mainly in Iran, and all of their proxies. That's why you find these are more the quote what moderate Sunni countries are looking at it. They're the ones who want to do it because they have a big interest in trying to do what they can to destroy Iran, because they pose the single greatest threat to the area, and they all know it. So with that being said, then this was to say, okay, it calls out absolutely who the bad guys are by name. Hamas, Hezbollah, they're the problem. Iran's the problem. And they say it in no uncertain terms. It's not ambiguous. It's straightforward, said exactly the problem. And then it also gives the solution, is the best way to get rid of those guys is for people to live in peace and prosperity within Israel and have commercial ties with them and bypass all these other people. It's never been thought of that way before.
So within the Muslims, you mentioned Hamas and over there in Iran and all that, there's even factions in between them where they are warring with each other. I think you talked last time about the Sunnis and all that. Why don't you explain a little bit about the troubles they're having within their own parties per se?
You know, the easiest way to understand it is that there are two factions in Islam, the two houses, Sunni and Shia. And basically it goes all the way back to the death of Muhammad, and there were going to be two people that were rivaling to take it over. Muhammad's hand-picked guy was a man named Ali. That's where you get the Shiites. And then there was the followers of Abu Bakr. Basically, he was the guy with all the influence. He was kind of the right hand. He was very high up, very close to Muhammad. So we have a very similar thing in our nation's history of a cult. And it was the Mormons who, when Joseph Smith died, Joseph Smith Jr. was the hand-picked guy, but Brigham Young had all the guns and the people. Wow, so he won, right? That's So that's basically the same thing. So the Reformed LDS Church from Joseph Smith Jr. is a small segment. The major LDS Church followed Brigham Young. Same thing here. The vast majority, about 85%, of Islam followed the Sunni, which is basically, we're talking about Abu Bakr at that point. Ali, the son-in-law of Muhammad, accounts with the Shiites for about another 15%. And that's the breakdown between the two houses, and they hate one another. And up until recently, Israel was the one thing that could get them to stop fighting amongst each other. But now you see that table's turning a little bit, because especially Iran and all of its state sponsoring of terrorists through its proxies has finally gotten to the point where the world has to say something's got to be done about this, and that part of the world is very, very concerned.
So the Sunnis, and who's actually the Iranians? They would be the Sunnis then, correct? Or is that...
No, the Iranians, they are Shiite, which is
Shiites. Okay.
which is much of
Okay.
the nation of Iraq is mainly Shiite, but it's run by a Sunni government. So if you want to
Okay.
be able to identify a
Wow.
Sunni, those are usually the guys with the checkered headgear with the little bands.
Okay.
Think Saudi Arabia.
Hmm.
That is a Sunni Muslim.
So Chris, what you're saying is that this peace plan is appealing to the common sense of a regular person who's trying to raise his family, trying to provide for his family, and as they're trying to appeal for the common man, that these so-called radicals, whoever they are, well, if they tried to impose their wills, that they would get ran over. Is that kind of the thinking that they're doing with this?
Well, sure, because imagine yourself if you're living, especially in Gaza under Hamas. What a horrible life you live. And most people don't realize this, but in Israel proper, outside of what we consider the West Bank or Gaza, there's roughly 1 million non-Jewish Arabs who live inside of Israel. And if commercially Israel really is blessed and God just prospers them, so also will those Arabs who live in Israel land, and the people on the other side of the border who are their kin are living in
Wow.
horrible conditions. That's going to put a lot of pressure on the governments, and
Yes.
that's the thought.
Okay. So with Israel, though, you did mention even right now during this COVID time, it's they're not receiving tourism. They're all. Did you say that they're all locked up over there right now?
Yeah, it's locked down again. So we personally, we had a trip scheduled for April of this year. We canceled it. Tried again in May, canceled. Had it rescheduled for October, and it has canceled as well because you can't get into the country without quarantine, and nobody can do
Well,
that.
the nation must be really hurting because that's one of their number one, way they make money over there is through tourism, and without the tourists, Israel itself must be hurting.
Yeah, anybody that's involved in the tourist end of it, high tech is doing well. The people who export their produce and flowers and things like that to Europe, they're probably doing okay. But the lifeblood of Israel is tourism, and it's non-existent right now, and the people are suffering like they haven't suffered, I don't know if ever, since becoming a nation.
Well, that's thanks for the update again. If you missed the last week's about 3 weeks ago, you can watch it on video on demand on his channel, or else visit Agape Chapel website, and I'll put Chris's up there too, where you can watch the full program concerning the peace plan and Israel. Well, last week we started introducing to you the second coming of Jesus Christ and the day of the Lord. And I'd like to pick that up again as it's described for us in Second Thessalonians, because I think it's very important, the things that Paul had to say. And Chris made mention on that last week's program how Paul was only there, they guess, maybe 3 weeks. And that guy must have had tremendous Bible studies with these everybody, because he had poured his heart and soul into the people, and really, in particular, the coming of the Lord and the rapture of the church. He sat with them, and where they had a full understanding. But as time went on, of course, people went in there, tried to distort the thinking and the teachings of Paul. So Paul had to write these letters to bring not only some correction about some false notion, but also to really do speak to them concerning the second coming of Jesus Christ and the day of the Lord. And as we closed off last week's program, we talked about how the day of the Lord, and when you speak in Jewish terms, you have to go back to Genesis to realize that the day of the Lord begins at nighttime there, and there in Genesis, how it starts, and how the day of the Lord, we'll see it happen with the darkness of the appearance of the Antichrist. And I'd like to pick it up and have Chris talk about it here in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3, where he says, "Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day, that being this day is the day of the Lord, shall not come, except there coming a falling away first, and that a man of sin may be revealed, as son of perdition." There's a lot in this verse here to unpack here, Chris, First of all, he tells us, let no man deceive you by any means. That tells me, we can be susceptible to deception. It could get any believers, and that's why we need to be on a solid ground. Talk about Paul's concern with the deception that was coming their way.
Yeah, and that goes in hand with the first couple of verses. His whole reason for addressing it in this place is that Thessalonica was pretty freaked out, and they were freaked out because somebody purporting themselves to be Paul somehow, some way had gotten into their minds that they were actually in the day of the Lord. And so, judgment was at hand. The church is now being judged. And so it's like, well, there's a whole lot of problems with this, he says. And so this is the case, that the man of sin would need to be revealed, and then there's this falling away. There are two schools of thought on what that falling away is. It is not harpazo like we see in 1 Thessalonians 4, but some people believe that means the rapture of the church, as opposed to others who believe that it refers to a great falling away in the way of apostasy. And it's not the word for apostasy, or it is apostasy in the text, but that it can mean either that there is a falling away spiritually or a falling away as in a removal from. And if that's speaking of the church, that's why people would say it's the rapture. Now,
yeah, because the word itself just means to depart, right, Chris?
Mm-hmm. So What we do know is that I don't need to look at this verse to know how the whole thing works, because what he says in 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5 is without that controversy. Because we know that there is an event that takes place. That's what he deals with in chapter 4. Comfort one another with these words. Then he pivots to the day of the Lord. So there's no question that if we understand what Paul's saying here, and I think it's pretty obvious that we do, that what happens is the man of sin will be revealed, but not until the church is first gone. So whatever verse you want to try to use, we do also know that there will be plenty of things that qualify as apostasy from Paul's other writings. So I don't need to get all worked up about what here is in 2 Thessalonians, because I know from everything else that Paul wrote on the topic, the church gets into a place of apostasy before the Lord's return. The rapture of the church takes place, and that opens the floodgates, if you will, for a whole series of other things that happen. But it is God pouring out his judgment on the earth. But the church is not here for judgment. So
no,
that's.
I'm glad you pointed that out, Chris. That God hasn't appointed us to wrath and to judgment, and the fact is that we will be taken out. I love this, is that they will be removed basically out of the picture, and that's, and I also want to make mention. We'll talk a little bit later in 2 Thessalonians about it, probably in the next week's program, about how the restrainer, the Holy Spirit, the Holy Spirit doesn't leave because he's God. But his attention now removes to the Jews rather than to the church, because the church has been removed. It's there in the presence of the Lord. Secondly, what we want to look at here, Chris, is, as you see here, is that once they were removed, then there's the man of sin will be revealed, the son of perdition at this time. Of course, the man of sin, we like to call him the Antichrist. I think that's the name that's been coined more than any other. There's actually around 30 different references of different names for this man of sin that he's going to be revealed. And as you look at the book of Revelation, Chris, and maybe you can shed some light on it, when you deal with this period of time, you're looking at Revelation chapter 6 through 18, when the tribulation comes upon this earth. It's interesting in the heavenly scene. It talks about the Lamb of God who's able to open the scroll that no man was able to open. As he opens a scroll, it tells us in verse 1 of chapter 6 that he sees the Lamb coming and taking the scroll out of the right hand of him who sitteth upon the throne. And he begins to talk about the breaking of the seal, or the opening of the seal. And he says there comes forth a white horse riding and conquering over the whole earth. And so as Paul tells us in 2 Thessalonians, the Antichrist is going to be revealed. Revelation chapter 6 talks about how this Antichrist is going to show up almost immediately. Why don't you talk a little bit about the Antichrist being revealed?
Sure. because then all the other things ensue right after that. So you have three other horse and horsemen that are revealed thereafter. The first four seals are revolving around horses and riders. And by the time it's all said and done, a quarter of the Earth's population is destroyed after the fourth seal. So that would be, it doesn't say about who is selected, but we're talking about 2 billion people. So whether it's war or pestilence, famine, whatever it may be, the way that people die, 2 billion of them are dead. It's interesting that by the time that you get to the fifth seal, then you start to see those people who are under the altar, and they're in heaven. And these are people who have been martyred for their faith and are saying, when are you going to avenge us? And we see what their reply to them is, when the other ones like you have, when that number is full, it means the rest of the martyrs who have not yet died. But these are what we would call tribulation saints. And it's one of the reasons why I just have a real hard time believing that somehow the church goes through this. Because if the church is there for this, the theory goes that it's the wrath of man and not the wrath of God. I reject that on its face, because Jesus is opening the seals. So, he's God, and he's the one who's bringing all of these things to pass. But be that as it may, then that would mean that some Christians die in this. They would have to, because there's nothing that says otherwise. So that would mean that you would have all the church, the faithful who have believed through the ages, are going to be separated from some other element of the church that dies in the tribulation, who can't get out from under the altar until the end of that judgment is over, which is the end of the tribulation. It makes no sense. So,
no.
But I know that people believe it, and it's a big place of contention.
So if we just take a look at the way Paul lays it out, how this Antichrist is going to be revealed after the church is removed, and we have no problem with the rest of it, especially when you line it up with the book of Revelation, chapter 6. And, Chris, we also will talk later in detail later on in other programs about the great Ezekiel battle that will happen, that will probably help issue in this man of peace, as we talked earlier about the, peace plan that's going on in Israel, that we think that might be a template for this man of sin, the Antichrist, to come in, because Daniel talks about he's going to come. At least it seems to be the first 3.5 years, there's going to be great peace and prosperity upon this earth as he comes in when he shows up on the scene. Is that the way you see scriptures, the first 3.5 years?
Yeah, and again, it's all relative, because if you've got 2 billion people dead in a course of a very short amount of time, that's just not situation normal. So it's not that he's going to come into a world that's just totally perfect and, just going about its merry way. 2 billion people have just died. We've never seen anything like that. So it's relative. But it's going to be relatively, speaking of the way that things are, that will all have subsided to some extent, but there will still need to be some real systemic problems, or else people would have no one to need to follow. So he's going to come onto the scene. We would assume that he's going to have to be somehow charismatic, because the world's going to follow him real quick. So, if it's bringing peace to some kind of conflict, if it's bringing all of those countries on in the way of peace, and establishing it with Israel, and then he turns on them. But this all has to happen in the course of 3.5 years.
Yeah, and the thing is that it's amazing. Sometimes we lose sight of that, the verses in Revelation where it talks about how he's going to be empowered by Satan himself, and he's going to be given him his throne, which is, I believe, the throne of this earth, if I read that correctly, Chris. And so he will not only have great charisma, but he'll have tremendous authority and power throughout the world, if we understand here. And so Paul is saying that this, first of all, the church is going to have to be taken away, and then this man of sin's going to be revealed, the son of perdition. And so he said, don't get shaken yet. You're not, even though you guys are going through heavy persecution. Jesus promised that the church will go through persecution. But as Chris has been talking about, when the man of sin reveals, that's going to bring on the wrath of God that's going to come against this ungodly world. And that's, I think, a very important distinction, Chris. Why don't you help us with that?
Yeah, because he does something almost unthinkable, and he defiles the very temple of God and ascribes worship to himself. It's referred to as the abomination of desolation. You can read about it from Daniel 12 all the way through the things that Jesus says in the Olivet Discourse. It's all, it's been discussed throughout the scriptures, but basically it will be ascribing worship to the beast himself in the very temple of God. It is the ultimate thumb in the eye, as he would see it, towards God. And God is, that's the abomination that causes desolation. And it goes really bad really quick from that moment on.
Well, a lot of what he's referring to is in the next verse, in verse 4. He says, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God, and that is worship, so that he as God sits in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Before we get into that verse, of course, in a little epistle of 1 John, it talks about there's many false gods or the Antichrist out there even this day, and you can see the purpose behind a lot of those who come against Christ. It says, who oppose and exalts themselves, anything that's called God. And my goodness, we're living in a world, we're living in society, we're living in really a nation where a lot of it goes against the things that exalts God, Chris. Why don't you talk about the present reality of the world we're living in and those who oppose God?
And this will show why it's such a singular offense, because it is an offense to God that man exalts himself, meaning that he takes away he arrests to himself what he thinks is his control and his sovereignty over things. And, of course, a person will die in that condition to find out how wrong they are. But when one person puts themselves as though they are God as a singular person, that's a whole new world. And this is a man who is already demonically indwelt, satanically indwelt and empowered. And then he does the ultimate offense to be worshipped as God in God's house. And then that's when it's like, see, the interesting thing that we need to realize, no matter how much it may look like this man or anyone else is in control, none of them can even draw breath if God does not allow them to draw breath. But the day comes when he finally says enough is enough. And we know that what starts that whole process is the very era of time that this is speaking of. So while it seems as though the devil will operate with impunity, he's on the clock. Because by chapter 19, Jesus comes back, and that's that. The armies arrayed against him are wiped out. Satan is bound and tossed into a pit for 1,000 years. Okay, great.
Wow.
Well, problem solved, or so we think. Man still has that will to rebel, and we find that happens during those 1,000 years. Satan is allowed to come back out, and people will once again follow him, and then he's put down for good. Chapter 20, he is thrown into what is the lake of fire, and that's that. There's no more.
Wow. But Chris, this is so powerful, so important, and believe it or not, we're running out of time. I want to pick this up next week with you, because there's something he speaks about there in verse 4. It says that so that he as God sitteth in the temple of God. Well, there's no temple in Israel right now. But we'd like to talk to you on our next week program how we see that there will be a new temple that's going to be built. What are they saying about it? What's going to go on? And there's exciting things in our future right around the corner, that as our world is going to get reshaped once again, as Paul talks about how not only is we as the church going to be removed, but there's going to be this man of sin revealed. So until next time, on behalf of Chris down in Texas, this is Terry. May God richly bless you.
For information about this broadcast, or if you have any questions, feel free to mail us at Agape Chapel OC, P.O. Box 4023, Huntington Beach, California, 92647. Or you can email us at aft@agapechapelOC.org. Or visit our website at agapechapelOC.org. Until next time,